I came to these woods carrying a weight no human should bear alone. My younger brother's death had hollowed me out, left me a shell walking through days that blurred into meaningless grey, and I needed the silence of the wilderness to either break me completely or teach me how to breathe again. The forests of Northern California stretched endlessly before me, ancient and indifferent, exactly what I craved. I wanted to disappear into something larger than my grief. The trailhead vanished behind me on that first morning, swallowed by towering redwoods that seemed to hold secrets in their bark. Every step took me deeper into a green cathedral where light filtered down in sacred beams, where the air tasted of moss and time itself. I carried only essentials, tent, provisions, my brother's compass still pointing true. What I was really searching for, I couldn't name. By the third day, I'd found a rhythm in the solitude, my thoughts finally quieting to match the forest's ancient pulse. The creek sang its endless song while I made camp, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than numbness. It was there, kneeling by the water to fill my canteen, that I saw them. Markings on the trees, deliberate and strange, and footprints pressed deep into the mud that made my breath catch and my skin prickle with an awareness I couldn't explain. The footprints were impossibly large, each one pressed nearly 2 inches into the soft earth beside the creek, the toes splayed with a width that suggested immense weight, distributed with careful precision. I knelt there in the fading afternoon light, my hand hovering above one of the impressions, not quite daring to touch it, measuring its length against my forearm and finding it exceeded by half. These weren't bear tracks, weren't elk or any creature catalogued in field guides I'd memorized as a boy. Whatever made these moved on 2 legs, deliberately, recently enough that water still seeped slowly into the deepest part of each depression. The tree markings drew my attention next. Parallel grooves, scraped into bark at heights I couldn't reach without climbing. Methodical patterns that spoke of intention rather than random animal behavior. I traced them with trembling fingers, feeling the exposed wood still slightly damp, and noticed how they formed sequences, almost rhythmic, as if someone had been counting or measuring distances along this stretch of forest. My rational mind offered explanations I didn't believe, while something older in my chest recognized a boundary marker, a declaration of presence. This was language, primitive and powerful, left for those who still knew how to read the wilderness. Darkness came quickly beneath the canopy, and I built my fire larger than necessary, feeding it with shaking hands, while my eyes kept darting toward the tree line, where shadows deepened into absolute black. The forest had changed around me, transformed from sanctuary into something watchful, and I felt the weight of attention pressing against my back like a physical thing. I wasn't alone here, hadn't been alone perhaps, since I'd entered these woods, and the knowledge settled into my bones with certainty. Whatever walked these ancient paths had been observing me, studying me, deciding something I couldn't yet comprehend. Sleep felt impossible, so I sat with my brother's compass clutched in one hand and my flashlight in the other, listening to the night sounds with new understanding. Every branch crack became a footfall, every rustle of leaves a deliberate movement, and I realized my fear had begun shifting into something more complex, something that felt strangely like recognition. The grief I'd carried here suddenly seemed smaller beneath this vast mystery, and I wondered if that was exactly why I'd been led to this particular creek. Some part of me, the part that still believed in my grandfather's old stories, understood I was being invited into something beyond explanation. The first call came just after midnight, rolling through the canyon like thunder given voice, a sound so deep it resonated in my sternum, vibrating through bone and tissue before my ears could fully process it. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, breath caught somewhere between my throat and lungs as the vocalization hung in the air for impossibly long seconds before fading into silence more profound than before. This wasn't the scream of a mountain lion or the howl of wolves, nothing in my experience of Wilderness nights had prepared me for this ancient rumbling that seemed to carry weight, intention, and something that made my eyes burn with unexpected tears. The second call answered from a different direction, higher pitched but equally powerful, and I recognized with startling clarity that these sounds were communication, a conversation. Happening in the darkness around my fragile circle of firelight. There was no aggression in those reverberating tones, no warning or territorial challenge, but rather something that struck me as profoundly mournful, as if the forest itself was giving voice to loss. My hand found my brother's compass again, gripping it like a talisman, and I realized I was crying now, the sounds unlocking something I'd kept carefully contained since the funeral. A third call, closer now, maybe 200 yards upslope, and this time I heard the nuance beneath the power. A questioning quality, almost gentle, as if whatever made that sound was checking on me, measuring my response to their presence. I stood without thinking, walked to the edge of my firelight, and did something that would have seemed insane just days before. I called back, not with words, but with my own wordless sound of grief, releasing it into the night like an offering, and the silence that followed felt like acknowledgement. The forest seemed to breathe around me, and I understood with sudden certainty that I'd been heard, truly heard, in a way that no well-meaning friend or therapist had managed since loss had hollowed me out and sent me running toward these mountains. Dawn broke with mist clinging to the forest floor, like something alive, and I emerged from my tent to find my world rearranged with impossible precision. The circle of stones surrounded my brother's compass, 12 perfectly spaced river rocks I absolutely had not placed there, each one smooth and deliberate as punctuation in a sentence I couldn't yet read. My hands trembled as I knelt before this arrangement, recognizing immediately that something had been here while I slept, close enough to touch my belongings, yet I'd felt no fear in my dreams, only a strange comfort I couldn't explain. The compass itself had been turned to face true north, though I'd left it pointing east toward home, and beside it lay a single white feather longer than my forearm, pristine and otherworldly in the morning light. I lifted it with reverence, feeling the weight of communication in this careful placement, understanding viscerally that last night's calls had been an introduction, and this was a response to my answering grief. Whatever walked these woods had heard my pain, had chosen to acknowledge rather than ignore it, and was now offering something I couldn't name, but desperately needed. I set up my phone and filmed the arrangement, speaking quietly about the impossibility before me, documenting the precise spacing of stones that formed a compass rose around my brother's final gift to me. My voice cracked as I explained the feather, the repositioned compass, the undeniable intelligence behind this nocturnal visitation, and I realized I was no longer afraid. I was grateful, impossibly and completely grateful, for this mysterious witness to my sorrow. I began filming everything after that morning, documenting each moment with trembling hands and a filmmaker's desperate need for proof. The forest had become a cathedral of watching eyes, and I sensed movement constantly. In my peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when I turned, presences that withdrew the moment I tried to focus directly on them. My footage captured what my conscious mind refused to see. Shadows that moved against the wind, massive forms gliding between ancient redwoods with a grace that physics shouldn't allow, and in one breathtaking sequence, something enormous crossing a distant ridge that walked upright, but was decidedly not human. That evening, reviewing the day's recordings, I found myself weeping at what the camera had witnessed, while my rational mind had looked away. There, at timestamp 14 minutes and 33 seconds, a figure stood partially obscured by morning. Fog, easily 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered and patient, watching me as I'd gathered water from the stream. The quality of its attention pierced through the digital footage, and I understood with sudden clarity that this being had been allowing me to see only what I could handle, revealing itself in increments matched to my readiness. I thought of my grandfather's stories about the Guardians, tales I'd dismissed as folklore, designed to comfort frightened children during camping trips. But he'd always told them with such conviction, such specific detail about their role as witnesses to human suffering, protectors of those wandering through grief's wilderness. Had he known something I was only now discovering, or had he too walked this path of impossible encounters? That night I sat by my fire and spoke directly to the darkness, thanking whatever listened for its patience with my disbelief and fear. I pulled out the leather journal my grandfather had left me, its pages yellowed and fragile, filled with sketches I'd always assumed were imaginative fiction. Now, studying them by firelight, I saw the anatomical precision in his drawings, the described gait, the specific hand structure with elongated fingers, the eyes that held what he called the weight of centuries. These weren't fantasies but field observations, documented with scientific care beneath the guise of storytelling, a legacy of truth disguised as myth. His final entry, written 3 weeks before his death, struck me with profound force. The Guardians appear only to those wandering the borderlands between who we were and who we must become. They are grief's witnesses, and their greatest gift is reminding us that transformation, not forgetting, honors our lost ones. I realized with startling clarity that my grandfather had met them during his own season of mourning, after losing my grandmother, and had left these pages as a map for family members who might one day need the same guidance. The journal included specific locations where encounters occurred, and I recognized with wonder that my unplanned route had followed his exactly, as if some instinct had guided my wandering feet along an invisible trail. He wrote of leaving tobacco and honey as offerings, of speaking grief aloud to the forest, of allowing tears to water the earth without shame. I had unknowingly performed these same rituals, my sorrow creating a frequency these ancient beings recognized and answered. Understanding flooded through me. I hadn't stumbled into this encounter by chance, but had been called to it by need, guided by ancestral memory toward a healing that transcended ordinary consolation. The waterfall roared behind me as I collapsed onto the smooth stones, the camera still recording on its tripod, forgotten in my anguish. 3 weeks of holding everything together shattered in that moment, and I sobbed with a rawness that felt like it might split me open. I spoke to my brother through the tears, apologizing for not being there, for surviving when he hadn't, for carrying guilt that had become heavier than grief itself. The mist from the falls wrapped around me like a cold embrace, and I surrendered to the pain I'd been running from since the day of his funeral. Later, back at camp, I reviewed the footage with trembling hands, expecting to delete my breakdown before anyone could witness such vulnerability. The timestamp showed 18 minutes of recording, though I remembered only moments of coherent thought during that collapse. At the 14-minute mark, my breath caught. There, partially obscured by swirling mist, but undeniably present, stood a figure of impossible height and stillness. Its silhouette suggested human form, stretched beyond natural proportion, and though the mist softened details, I could see its head tilted downward, watching me with what felt unmistakably like compassion rather than curiosity. I replayed the sequence a dozen times, each viewing revealing new details my rational mind struggled to dismiss as tricks of light or water vapor. The figure's breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the falls, its chest rising and falling with ancient patience. Most unsettling was its complete stillness amid the churning mist. Everything else moved with the wind except this sentinel, this witness to my unraveling. When I finally looked up at precisely 14:32 in the footage, the figure stepped backward into deeper fog, disappearing as though it had granted me the privacy my awareness demanded. The footage changed everything, transforming abstract sensing into documented reality that I could no longer rationalize away or attribute to exhaustion and grief. The morning after reviewing that footage, I found them. Clusters of wild huckleberries placed deliberately on a flat stone beside my tent, arranged in a pattern that mimicked the constellation my brother had tattooed on his forearm. My hands shook as I photographed them, understanding this was no coincidence, no random act of nature. Something had watched me grieve, had seen into the depths of my sorrow, and was responding with a tenderness that defied every assumption about what lurked in these ancient woods. I ate the berries slowly, each one tasting like forgiveness I hadn't known I was seeking. The gifts continued over the following days, each one appearing at moments when I felt most lost or uncertain about my route. Stacked stones marked safe passages around treacherous ravines I would have blindly approached. Broken branches pointed toward fresh water, sources when my supplies ran low. Once I discovered my path blocked by a wall of deliberately placed deadfall, forcing me to backtrack and discover later that a rock slide had devastated the original trail hours after I would have crossed it. I was being shepherded through the wilderness by something that understood both the terrain and my fragile state of mind. My grief began shifting from a weight that crushed to something I could finally carry, lightened by the inexplicable partnership forming between myself and my unseen guardian. I started leaving my own offerings, sketches of my brother, written memories placed under stones, photographs pinned to trees, creating a dialogue without words. The forest had become a cathedral where my mourning transformed into something sacred, witnessed and honored by a presence older than my comprehension. On the 6th morning, I found my brother's compass, the one moved that first night, placed atop a cairn of 7 stones, all pointing toward the valley that would lead me home. I knew that. Final night would be different. The air held a charged stillness as I built my fire, the flames casting dancing shadows that felt like they were announcing something inevitable. I positioned my camera on a tripod, not for documentation anymore, but as a witness to whatever transformation was coming. The forest had gone silent in the way cathedrals do before a sacred moment begins. The footsteps came just after midnight, deliberate and unhurried, each one vibrating through the earth and into my chest. I stood slowly, my fear dissolved into something like reverence, as the towering figure emerged from the tree line 50 feet away. In the firelight, I could see its form, massive, covered in dark hair, impossibly human in its posture, yet utterly other. Our eyes met, and in that gaze I felt my brother's presence wash over me like warm water. No words passed between us, yet I understood everything in that eternal moment. The creature's eyes held the same kindness my brother had possessed, that same gentle acceptance of all I'd failed to say before he died. My chest opened with a sob that had been trapped there for months, and I whispered the apology I'd been carrying like stones in my pockets. The guardian remained motionless, witnessing my release without judgment. When I looked up again, tears streaming down my face, the space where it had stood was empty, except for morning, mist beginning to form. But the weight I'd carried into these woods had lifted, replaced by a peace that felt like my brother's final gift. I was ready to go home. I returned to civilization 3 days later, my pack lighter, but my heart heavier with the weight of wonder. The footage on my camera remained untouched, stored like a sacred text I wasn't sure the world deserved to see. When I finally watched it in my apartment, the figure was there in the mist, undeniable yet impossible, a testament to mysteries that choose who witnesses them. I never showed it to anyone except my mother, who wept and said she felt him too in that ancient knowing gaze. The grief didn't vanish like mourning, fog, but it transformed into something I could carry with grace instead of desperation. I understood now that my brother hadn't truly left, that love doesn't end when breath does. It simply changes form and finds new ways to reach us. The wilderness had offered me a guide when I was lost, a mirror when I needed to see myself clearly, a witness to pain too deep for human words. Some would call it Sasquatch, others would call it delusion, but I know what I encountered was older and more compassionate than either explanation allows. I keep my grandfather's stories alive now, sharing them with anyone who'll listen, knowing they were never warnings or fantasies, but maps for the grieving. The Data compass sits on my desk, forever pointing toward that clearing where I found myself again. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that guttural call echoing in my memory. And instead of fear, I feel gratitude. The forest keeps its secrets, but it shared one with me when I needed it most. Have you ever felt a presence you couldn't explain watching over you in your darkest moment? Subscribe to hear more stories from the edge of belief.